Nathan had been the captain of the Kingsguard for 15 years, and his father had held the position before him. He'd seen a lot of strange behavior around the palace in that time, a lot of false flattery, a lot of yelling, a lot of begging, but he'd never had such a strange day as today. A couple of weeks ago, the king had declared that there would be a wedding feast for his son, and he'd invited all those who had been close to him, his allies and his servants, but they had unexpectedly declined the invitation. Another invitation had gone out this week, but in a shocking display, some of the invited had even seized and killed the messengers. Soldiers were now marching down the roads to those traitors. Nathan had wondered how the king would react. After all, he knew the king to be a person of passion, but also of measured coolness. He was a gracious Lord and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and ready to relent from punishing. But how would he react to this? As the last messenger came in and relayed his message, Nathan thought he might finally see his Lord at a loss for what to do. But as he had seen so many times before, the king seemed to be ready for this. After dealing with his generals and arranging his affairs, he called all his servants, including Nathan, to stand before him. "Go into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet." The servants stood still for a few moments. It was hard to believe what they were hearing. Invite common people off the street to the wedding banquet of the king? But with a gesture, the king dismissed them, and they quickly filed out of the main gate to the palace to do his bidding. Nathan pushed to the head of the column and quickly gave orders to all the servants so that they would go to different parts of the city, the street of the butchers, the street of the tailors, even the street of the prostitutes. He himself headed for the street of the potters, which he was familiar with. He walked down the street crying, "A great feast! His Majesty has opened the wedding banquet to all of his subjects. Everyone is invited." Every once in a while, he would step into a house to make sure everyone had heard the message. So he stopped into the shop of Ehud, a potter of some local fame. Ehud was already putting on a tattered set of wedding robes and getting ready to head out the door, and he gave Nathan a nervous smile. "Why everyone? The king has always lavished his feasts on the chosen. Why people like me?" Nathan shrugged. "Those who were invited became complacent, rude, even murderous. The king is doing something new now." Ehud looked at his robe. "Hope he won't have second thoughts once he sees me. I'm not worthy to be in the presence of the king, much less sit at table with him. Nevertheless, I am his obedient servant." Nathan nodded and headed out the door. Moving down the street, he passed small groups of people in various qualities of dress. Silas the wine seller was dressed in sumptuous wedding robes. Everyone knew Silas cut his wine with water, and he had made good coin doing it. Most of the potters had robes like Ehud. It hadn't been easy for the potters of the city, since the neighboring city had started sending low-quality, cheap pottery in by the wagon load. And speaking of that, Nathan saw Balaam, the pottery merchant from the neighboring city, down at the end of the street. Balaam didn't seem to be in any particular hurry and was continuing to try to sell to passing groups of dressed-up wedding guests, even as they hurried towards the palace. Nathan approached Balaam. "Balaam, I'm sure you know that the king has demanded the attendance of everyone at the city at the wedding feast. Shouldn't you be getting into your wedding robes?" Balaam looked at Nathan with a combination of calculation and insubordination. "Why, Captain, I don't see any reason why I should hurry. I have plenty of time to get to the banquet, and there's coin to be made in the meantime. Besides," and he looked at his clothing, "business is so good that even my trade clothes are better than the robes of any of the potters from this city that they're going to be wearing. I'm sure the king will be much more appreciative of my sense of fashion than theirs." Nathan paused. "Listen, Balaam, the king is pretty clear. While he's slow to anger, he expects his servants to bear fruit worthy of his benevolence. He's not into flash, he's into substance." Balaam surveyed Nathan with what could only be described as abject scorn. "Listen, Captain, I've been around more kings than you, and they all respect two things: power and the wealth that backs it up. Your king isn't any different. I have the coin, and I understand power. He will respect that. Now, excuse me." And Balaam went back to trying to hawk his wares to the passerbys. Nathan took 2 deep breaths, did a smart about face, and started to march back to the palace. "It's not my place to judge. It's not my place to judge," he muttered as he kept putting one foot ahead of the other. It was the king's place to judge. It was Nathan's to get back to the palace and make sure everything was secure. When he returned to the palace, Chaos seemed to be the order of the day. People of all walks of life were everywhere around the palace, seated, standing, lying down, drinking, talking, making shady business deals. He summoned the guards, and bit by bit they managed to get the affair organized, seating everyone in a vague semblance of order. As he was finishing, he saw Balaam slip through the gate and take a seat near Ehud. Even from this distance, he could tell Balaam was heaping insult upon injury, making Ehud feel insignificant in his tattered robes. He thought about going over there and making things uncomfortable for Balaam, but just then a horn blew. The king was coming into the banquet. Nathan barked an order, and his guards presented arms in a unified clash. The king was resplendent in his royal robes. He carried his royal staff in his hand and wore a jeweled diadem on his brow. He moved with a grace and fluidity that bespoke gentleness and high breeding. His face bore an engaging smile that seemed to radiate a golden light from all around his person. The king made his way around the room, and his minstrels moved with him, playing a merry tune upon their psalteries and lyres. As he approached each guest, he would take a handful of oil from a vat held by a servant and pour it over the guest's head, saying, "Friend, you are welcome." Suddenly the king stiffened and turned his head towards the table with the potters. A change came over his face, a kind of sadness seemed to unfold it along with hints of anger, and he strode purposefully across the room. The king stopped at the table, then turned to Balaam. "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" demanded the king. Balaam looked back at the king, dull surprise evident in his eyes. But your majesty," he sputtered, "these are the finest clothes that—" The king interrupted him. "Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth," he cried in a loud and booming voice. Balaam tried to rise, but instead got his foot caught on the leg of his chair. Tripping and falling, he fell heavily on a clay pot that he had set next to him, smashing it and sending pieces of silver skittering across the floor, one of which found its way under the foot of the servant bearing the vat of oil, upsetting his balance and causing him to drop the vat. The oil exploded from the shattering vat and flowed all around the feet of the king. The king looked at Nathan, who had already started to stride over to the table. Nathan stepped behind Balaam. "My pleasure, your majesty," and he lifted the struggling Balaam over his shoulder and headed towards the gate. As the two headed out the gate, one under his own power, the other trussed up and helpless, Balaam whined, "But I don't understand. My clothes were finer and in better condition than those of the other potters. Why me?" Nathan stopped outside the gates, tossed Balaam on the ground, wiped his hands, and favored Balaam with a withering glance. "You were invited to a wedding banquet by a king. Instead of moving swiftly, you acted as if it were owed you, and as if it was of little consequence. And then you didn't even have the decency to put on the proper garment." "But these clothes," sniffed Balaam, "are not what the occasion required," interrupted Nathan. "And even now, you try to justify your folly as the other potters worry about the decency of the little they can afford to dress themselves in. Yet the king will deem them worthy." "I know you've had a lot of experience with kings," said Nathan sarcastically, "but our king is a gracious Lord and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. He judges by the sincerity of the response, not the sumptuousness. He is a king. He has all the wealth he requires. What he really desires are servants that do his bidding." And with that, he turned and strode through the palace gates, and the doors clanged shut behind him. Amen.